Okay, welcome to Lesson 13. In this lesson, we're going to talk about Essay 2. I'm going to give you the Essay 2 assignment sheet, which you can find right underneath this lesson on the learning software. And I'm also we're going to review a sample of a summary response essay to see how the person develops the summary response. It's a pretty good example of the kind of thing that I'm going to be looking for. So let's move into it. So we have 3 objectives for this lesson. So the assignment sheet is going to be given again at during this lesson. We're going to review the key strategies for summarizing and responding to an essay, and like I just mentioned, we're going to look at a sample summary response essay. So let's take a quick look at the Essay 2 assignment sheet. As I just mentioned, you can get that off of MyCC. I'm going to put it right below this lesson, Lesson 13. Let's take a quick look at it. Here's the assignment sheet. So it's very similar to the assignment sheet for the first essay. At the top we have the name of the assignment. So this is the summary response essay, Essay 2. This is writing 1. So here are the deadlines. This essay is going to be a little bit longer than the first essay. The first essay I had to do 2 to 3 page argument. For this essay I'm going to have you do 3 to 4 pages, so it's slightly longer. So the first draft is going to be due as soon as possible, right? So you can start working on this essay after this lesson. Well, after this lesson, I'd suggest you watch the next lesson on the grammar feature, but you can start working on this essay soon. And once you finish the essay, just email it to me here, just like you've been doing with all the other assignments, at brooks.winchell@go.cambridgecollege.edu. So you'll send me a first draft, and I'll give you some feedback on that first draft, and I'll email it back to you. I'm going to try to do that within 24 hours if I can. And then after you get my feedback, try to revise the essay and email me the final draft of the essay. That final draft will be worth 50 points. And I'll give you a grade out of 50 on it. Once you've emailed me your final draft, you can start moving on to Lesson 15 in Unit 3. And you'll be about halfway through the course, so that's great. Let's take a look at the overview for this assignment. So the response, or the summary response, is a classic academic, particularly college assignment. So lots of colleges give this assignment, lots of classes give it. Many of your classes will require you to complete them, though your professors won't always explain exactly what they want. Essentially, a response, or a summary response, is an opinion offered in conversation with a reading. At its most basic, a response should always contain an explanation of the reading that you're responding to, or a summary, they say, and your response or opinion based on that reading, an I say. So this assignment then follows the most basic prescription of Graph's template for academic writing. They say, I say, and it's intended to help you hone some of those essential academic skills that we've been talking about in Lesson 9, 10, and 11. So that's the overview for the assignment. Let's take a quick look at the actual assignment that I want you to do for this essay. Here's the assignment section. So over the last few lessons, I've discussed some of the tools of academic writing, and you've completed 3 readings on a loose theme of obesity issues in America, or weight issues in America, or how to handle obesity in America. We've read several articles that speak to this topic in one way or another, and we've examined how they offer opinions in dialogue with what others say. So for instance, we read Zinchenko's Don't Blame the Eater, and we read Balko's, which was kind of a direct opposite to what Zinchenko said. His essay was What You Eat Is Your Business. Then we read Judith Warner's article that takes a slightly different position than Zinchenko and Balko, but are still sort of talking about the same thing. What should we do, if anything, about weight in America? So all of these have varying perspectives on who should be responsible for obesity and whether or not it's really a problem. In doing so, they help you to understand the various pieces of the conversation. So with this base of understanding, it's time to put in your or offer your opinion in response to one of 2 articles. So I want you to read 2 more articles that are talking about issues with food and weight in America. They're slightly different than the ones that we've read so far, but you still probably can connect some of the things that we've read so far with these articles. So I want you to read Susie Orbach's article, Fat is a Feminist Issue, It's got a really interesting thesis. I think you'll like it. It's on page 448 in the graph book. And I also want you to read Michael Pollan's Escape from a Western Diet. And here he talks about what he sees as problematic Western diet. It's a nice one as well. That's on page 434 in graph. So read these two, and then pick one of the two, and I want you to complete a summary response essay based on that article. So here's the writing process for this essay. So we've been discussing ways of capturing what they say, how to summarize and quote effectively, and how to use APA style, and how to respond, how to offer your opinion to articles. So I had you complete some journals to hone these skills, and then you should put what you've learned into use into this essay. So start by reading both potential articles, the Auerbach and the Warner, then choose one that you feel like you can make a nice opinion or give a nice response to. Keep in mind that the heart of the essay should be your opinion and defending that opinion. So you may want to use some of the other articles that we've read, the Zinchenko, the Warner, or the Balco, in developing your opinion, but your opinion should be done in response to what either Pollan or Auerbach says. So the Pollan article or the Auerbach article should be the center of your essay. You should have a complete summary of whichever one you choose, and your response should be directed to the article that you choose, even though you could bring in some of the other ones to help support your ideas. So in this sense, it will be important for you to summarize and quote from the article that you're responding to, and use those as entry points for your own ideas in your response. So the grading for this essay is going to be based on the clarity of your responses and the support that you offer for those responses, how well you capture the essay, either Pollan's or Auerbach's, in a complete, accurate, and compressed summary, and the use of your academic moves, so like how you transition from your summary into your response. You might also want to use some of the templates that Graph has been suggesting in some of the chapters that we've been reading, especially chapter 2, 3, and 4. Also the way you organize the essay, how you organize your paragraphs, and the correct use of pronouns, which is going to be our grammar feature for this essay that I'm going to discuss in lesson 14, in addition to sentences like I discussed from unit 1. So that's basically the assignment. Here's my email. If you have any questions, you can email me there, or you can, that's where you should email me your final draft. Again, just email me the first draft as soon as possible. Try to make it about 3 to 4 pages, plus it should have a reference page. And I'll give you feedback on it, and then your final draft will be due after my feedback. Review my feedback and correct it for the final. So that's the assignment sheet. So you can take a look at it if you want. You can download it from the learning software. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how to write this essay effectively. I'm just going to give you a couple of tips, even though the assignment sheet gives you some pretty good tips as well. You're going to want to start with an introduction. So you should have something that introduces the topic generally, right? You don't necessarily want to jump right into your summary and give the author and title and main idea and say, in Escape from a Western Diet, Pollan writes about. I don't want everybody's essay to start exactly the same way. So yes, you should have the author and title and main idea, but that should probably come at the end of your intro. Otherwise, you want your intro to, just like we talked about with essay 1, start a little bit more broadly and sort of funnel us into the point of your essay, which is to summarize and respond to either Pollan or Auerbach's article. So depending on the article you choose, you might just talk a little bit more generally about the topic of their article and sort of work into that summary. So definitely try to add an introduction to this. The end of your introduction, you should probably introduce, the article that you're going to be summarizing, probably the author and title and main idea. And then after you do, you want to move into your summary, right? So your summary should be complete, accurate, and compressed, like we talked about in the summarizing lesson. I think it could pretty easily be 1 to 2 pages for an essay like this, especially because the Auerbach and Pollan articles are a little complicated. There are some things that you definitely want to make sure you put into the summary. In addition, you probably want to use some quotes to help support your summary as you're developing it. And when you do use quotes, you want to make sure that you're using APA style. right, to sort of introduce the quotes seamlessly, and make sure you put the page numbers. Once your summary is done, you want to have a nice clear transition into your response, and I talked about that in the last lesson. You might say something like, after reading Auerbach's article, I agree with her, disagree with her, or both, but have a nice clear transition when you move into your response. There's an example. After reading this essay, I agree, disagree, both. Make sure your response is multiple paragraphs, right? So you definitely want a really multifaceted response here, not just a single paragraph or 2 paragraphs, but I would say at least 3 or 4 paragraphs of response, or 3 or 4 different angles. You might agree, you might disagree, you might look at a couple of different points. Make sure that when you're developing your points, you use examples from your own life, things that you've seen or things that have happened to you. You could also use support from some of the articles that we've been reading. I don't really want you to go out and do research yet, but you could bring in Zinchenko or Balko or Warner's article, or even if you're doing Auerbach, you could talk about Poland's articles. You could use some of those as support, but I wouldn't say necessarily go out and do more research on the topic, but you could use something like that in addition to some of your own examples and experiences. Then finally, make sure you end with a conclusion. So your conclusion should, probably wrap up the essay and sound kind of like a conclusion. And then I already mentioned this, but when you're going to use quotes, make sure you're using APA style. Or if you bring in other authors, you're definitely going to want to make sure you clearly mention those authors and give them credit for their ideas as well as their dates and page numbers if it's a direct quote. At the end, I want you to create a reference page. So your reference page will need to include the article that you're responding to, but it could also include other articles, like if you bring Zinchenko into your essay or Balko into your essay, you want to also put them on your reference page as well. So this is a really good chance to practice creating your reference page, and I'll give you feedback on that after you send the first draft. So let's just take a quick look at a sample summary response essay, and we'll read through the entire thing and talk about how this person develops his summary response. Okay, so here it is. This is a full summary response essay, very similar to the one that I want you to do, and it's actually a summary response essay to Warner's essay. So we just read Warner's essay, so you should be familiar with Warner's Junking Junk Food. This is a summary response to Junking Junk Food, and we can see how he does it when we read through this essay. So we got pretty good. It's about 3 full pages, which is nice. That's about the length I'm looking for. Plus it has a reference page at the end. So notice how he put his reference on a separate page. He called it reference. He put in the reference for Warner. If you're citing Warner, this is exactly how you want to do it, just like we talked about in the last lesson. It has the author, the year, the title, and then it has and then it has the editors, and then it has the name of the book, the page numbers, and the place of publication, and the publisher. So definitely make sure you add a reference page onto yours as well. Let's go back up to the top. Notice how, again, he has a nice header, just like you did with essay 1. You want to have your name, the professor, the class, and the date that you wrote the essay. He also put a running header up here. So we haven't talked about that yet, but for longer papers, you are supposed to put a running header that mentions your last name and the page number. So you could practice doing that with this essay. If you do put a header in, don't just type in your name at the top of the page and then type each page number on each page. You want to insert page number. So you go up here and you do insert, and you click page number over here, and you'll want it at the top right. So you click this one down here, and it'll put the page number in, and then it'll put the cursor right next to the page number. And then you can just type in your last name or your header, and then the header will be open, so just click on the page and the header will close. That's the best way to do the header for that one. You don't have to do it for this essay, but it could be worth trying. So let's take a look at his essay. So the title of his essay is Obesity, a Growing Epidemic, which I think is a pretty good title for the essay. He starts his essay right here. Obesity is a growing concern in many American families. The government and many people are blaming fast food industries for the cause of obesity. Some people, like David Zinchenko, expresses the idea that people do not have other choices in finding healthier alternatives, and on top of that is the lack of information about the food. Zinchenko argues that there are no calorie information charts on the fast food packaging the way that there are on grocery store items. Many Americans would support these ideas and encourage the government to be proactive and enact new rules to add warning labels and nutrient information of the food that's being eaten. However, some people would argue that it's not the fast food industry's fault and blame it more on personal responsibility. So here, he starts really well with a general introduction to the topic, obesity and how it's kind of a problem in America. And he even introduces some of the viewpoints on obesity as a way to introduce Warner. So he says some people like Zinchenko, so he actually talks about Zinchenko up here, some people think that fast food companies need to take more responsibility, and he quotes Zinchenko well. And then down here he sort of says other people have different views and blame it more on personal responsibility. In his next paragraph, he goes on to talk about people who blame it more on personal responsibility. Balco, so you can imagine he makes a nice connection to Balco here. There are no incentives to live a healthy lifestyle. One man that would agree is Radley Balco, 2002. Balco says that states are preventing private health insurance companies from providing health incentives like cheaper cost on premiums. He continues to argue that Americans are becoming too focused on each other's health and not their own health. Balco, 2002. There are many people with different ideas on how to reduce obesity. They blame the government or personal responsibility, but Judith Warner's 2012 article, Junking Junk Food, has the best arguments for fighting obesity. Does that sound like a strong statement? This is actually his thesis right here. So he actually has a pretty good thesis statement in part of his introduction. I would say that this whole 2 paragraphs is really his introduction, and that his introduction ends with this thesis saying Judith Warner has the best arguments in her article, Junking Junk Food. So he does you don't have to do this, but he has a pretty elaborate introduction where he sort of talks about the issue of obesity in America, and he talks about some of the perspectives. So he mentions Zinchenko, and he actually quotes Zinchenko, and then he mentions Balco. He doesn't quote Balco, but he summarizes Balco's ideas about how people need to take personal responsibility, and then he uses that as a bridge into Warner's essay. So he says, Judith Warner has the best arguments for fighting obesity. So he introduces the article here. So I would say this is the end of the intro. An introduction doesn't necessarily have to be 1 paragraph. I'm not saying you have to do this, but he does have kind of an interesting introduction to the essay. So from there, after he introduces Warner, he jumps right into the summary of Warner's essay. So let's take a quick look at that. Judith Warner claimed that our culture as a whole has to change in order for obesity to stop. That's Warner's main idea. So he starts right off with the main idea, which is basically that culture has to change in order for obesity to stop. Warner mocks the Obama administration in their weak attempts to lower obesity. Warner cites a government health inspector that shut down a 7-year-old's lemonade stand, page 401. Warner believes that you can't just change the amount of food people eat. You need to change the way of life. She believes that culture of food needs to change to reduce obesity. She continued to argue by pointing out that in World War II, the rationing systems, which mentions the World War II example, allowed soldiers to be fed in war and also had a result of less food consumption in America. The system was effective because the government fought the idea of eating less in 2 ways: the nutritional aspects and the psychological aspects. This led to a massive cultural change because it caused people to eat less and made them feel like they were contributing to the efforts in the war. So here, he clearly moves into his opinion. So I think he does capture Warner's main idea pretty well, which is that Americans need to change the culture of food in America in order to change the obesity problem. And she does mention some of the sub-points that Warner mentions, like Warner does talk about the World War II example, and he mentions that pretty well. There's a couple of things that he doesn't mention in here, though, so I think his summary is not entirely complete. I do think what he has here is pretty accurate, but he is missing a couple points. Like he doesn't mention the cigarettes. He could have done a little bit more on the background with Obama and people and how people are upset about food in schools. He doesn't really mention a whole lot of that. He just mentioned a little bit of it, so it's not quite complete as it could be. But he does have a summary here. Make sure your summary is a little bit more complete than this one. Plus, this is only a paragraph. I think he had a really nice introduction, and then he kind of rushed the summary a little bit here. So that could be a little stronger in this essay. But let's take a look at how he moves into his response. So he starts his response here, and he has a really nice transition. After reading Warner's article, I agree that cultural change is the way to go for a healthy lifestyle. So here he has a really clear position. He mentions that it's his idea. He says I, and he says he agrees with her main point that cultural change is the way to go. I believe that culture has a huge influence on how and why we eat. When I was in elementary school, a new product just came out called Lunchables. The Lunchables were the rage in my school. Almost everyone had them but me. So every time I had lunch, I always felt jealous that I didn't have the Lunchables. I always wanted to eat them with my friends, so one day I went to my mom and begged her to get it for me, and she did. The very next day at lunch, I was intoxicated in euphoria that I was part of the trend. This is an example of how culture has an influence in the way people eat. Since everyone was eating Lunchables, I had an influence to eat that as well. This shows how powerful trends are, because even though it was Lunchables, I'm pretty sure that I would have eaten vegetables if everyone was eating them. This is a really nicely developed response. He has a great example here. He sort of recognizes that food is based on culture, and he gives his own personal example of how food was connected to culture for him with Lunchables. And he does a really nice job of connecting it back to Warner's idea here, where he says, this is an example of how culture has an influence in the way people eat. You know, since everybody was doing that, he felt like he wanted to. So he can really see her point, and he knows exactly why. So here he's agreeing, but he's taking it that step further. He's not just agreeing, but he's also sort of adding something new, right? Like we talked about in the last lesson. So there's a good start to the response. Let's take a look at the next section. In the article, Warner talks about cigarettes. Warner talks about how changes of an idea of something can be an effective tool to help reduce obesity. She explained that cigarettes stopped being portrayed as sexy and cool and started being seen as terribly disgusting addictive product. This idea is still happening today for cigarettes. Flip through today's TV channel, and you will see one of the cigarette commercials, that shows the side effects of smoking. It shows an old lady that is bald and has a hole in her throat. These ads are intended to scare people and enforce the idea that smoking is bad. I feel that if we can do the same thing with fatty foods, If we advertise all negative effects of eating unhealthy, we can change the view of sugar, salt, fat as socially unacceptable. So here he's also agreeing with Warner. He's mentioning the point that she has about the cigarettes as an example of cultural change. I think he should have mentioned that more in his summary, but he is kind of reacting to it well. He's sort of saying that that was effective. He agrees with her. He has seen the ads himself. He still sees the ads today, and he knows that that's an effective campaign. And he can imagine that a campaign like that would help with eating as well. He probably could have taken it a step further here and given us a picture of what one of those campaigns would look like. He doesn't quite get to that, but he does tell us the idea that the campaign could be helpful. So I think he has another good point that he adds to his summary right there. So in this paragraph, he's moving on to somebody who might disagree, right? So he's bringing in the opposite side as well, although I'm not sure that he necessarily disagrees with Warner at all. He says, however, some people might not agree with Warner. Michelle Obama would most likely disagree with Warner, saying that the cause of obesity is due to not enough exercise. In her speech to the NAACP, she said that African American children spend an average of nearly 6 hours a day watching TV. That extra hour of TV they watch is associated with the consumption of an additional 167 calories. Obama 2014. She points out that kids spend too much time watching TV and not enough time outside. This may be the case, but like I said before, if they advertise the negative effects of being unhealthy, then kids watching TV all day will get scared and try to become active. Okay, I'm not sure that that's entirely true, but he does bring in another source to sort of talk about somebody who might oppose Warner. We didn't actually read this article by Michelle Obama. It is in the book. You could read it if you wanted to, but he decided to bring in that one to kind of show somebody who might disagree with Warner about changing culture. Michelle is much more about fitness. So there's just another facet to the response. So he has kind of two paragraphs that agree in slightly different ways, and he has this one paragraph that kind of opposes. And here he moves into his conclusion. He says, people may have different ideas on reducing the growing problem of obesity. Some might say that kids are spending way too much time watching TV, and some might say that it is personal responsibility. But Judith Warner's Junking Junk Food has the clearest path to fight the epidemic. Her idea is that you can't change specific eating behavior without addressing that way of life, without changing our culture of food. This seems like the most effective strategy, since we won't be telling companies and people what they can or can't do, but at the same time we can make a healthy change. So pretty nice conclusion, right? He's not really bringing new points into the conclusion. He's just sort of reiterating what he said before. Here's kind of his thesis that he agrees with cultural change. He kind of mentions that again, and he just sort of makes a nice ending for how a good cultural change would be the most effective way to change eating habits in America. So pretty good conclusion here, I think. So overall, I think this is a relatively strong essay. I think that he could have developed the summary a lot more. That's one part that's missing. He does have a really interesting introduction. I don't think your introduction needs to be quite that elaborate, but he does have a nice introduction. And he does a good job connecting a few other sources in here. Plus, his APA style is very nice. He has a good reference, even though technically he should have had the references for all of the authors that he cited in here. And he does a good job putting the dates and the page numbers along with his sources as well. So here's a pretty good example. So if you do something like this, I think you'll make a pretty good essay. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. So here's a couple of tips to help you get your draft started. Right? So again, you want to use the writing process just like we did with the first essay, right? I said you work through this with any type of thing that you're writing, make sure you're using this writing process for this essay as well. So you want to start by reading both essays and really understanding what the essays are about. As you're reading, you want to make sure that you're annotating your sources carefully, making some notes in the margin, underlying things that seem important, so that you can understand the essay and go back to some of your notes when you're writing this. Plus, you might put some questions in here or potential things that you might want to respond to, so spend some time annotating as well. After you read and annotate and understand, really start generating ideas for your response. So what do you want to respond to in the essay? What's the main point of the essay? What are some of the subpoints? What are some of the ways you could agree, or some of the ways that you could disagree? So once you generate some ideas for your response, you want to start planning your essay. So what are you going to do for the introduction? What are going to be some of the main points in your summary? If you're going to use multiple paragraphs, which you probably should, how are you going to organize those paragraphs? What's going to be your transition into your response? And then what are going to be the points that you make in your response? Are you going to make points for? So are you going to make points that agree? Are you going to make points that disagree? How are you going to organize those points? Which ones are going to come first, second and third? So those are some things to consider as you're planning the essay. And then once you have a good plan, you just want to write your first draft. So just sit down and write the first draft from start to end, the summary and your responses. And then after, you want to go back and revise your work and think about if there's any points you need to develop, and make sure you edit your work too, and pay special attention to pronouns, which we're going to talk about in the next essay, and sentences, like we talked about with Unit 1. So once you have your essay done, you want to just email me your draft, right? Again, make sure you email it to me here. It should be complete, about 3 to 4 pages, and you do want a reference page. I'm going to send you some feedback, and I'll try to get that back quickly. So take my feedback and then try to revise that one and send me your final draft. And once you send me your final draft, you can move on to Unit 3 and start watching video lesson 15. And I'll get that final draft back to you soon. And once you do move on to Unit 3, you'll be about halfway through the course, which is fantastic. So here's my smiley face again. I think you'll be very happy when you get to that point. So feel free to email me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing your essays soon. Bye for now.